how the Aeons of fire and Thelete calibrated our endowment, how they designed and engineered our capacities to live and act as the creatures we are. Anthropos 10, the 10th strain of the Anthropos template embedded in the Orion Nebula. There are basically 7 components in the calibration, starting with 1, which is the substrate of all calibrations of sentient life, nous, the gift of divine intelligence, which emerges in the material reality as nucleic acid. 2, dianoia, our capacity for communication and signal systems, codes, signals. 3, metanoia, our capacity to form paradigms and to understand systems and then go beyond that framework into other systems and other systems, to continually outgrow our own understanding of systems so that we don't become locked in any single system or paradigm. 4, perinoia, the ludic capacity to play and pretend. 5, enthemesis, which means that which is in the thymus. It means the enthusiasm and passion of embodiment, the erotic capacity. Then the 2 signatures of the designing aeons. Free will, the signature of Thelete, which gives us our latitude, which is a dangerous latitude. You give an animal that much rope, and there's a risk it's going to hang itself. And wisdom, the cognitive capacity for ever higher learning that comes from the wisdom goddess herself. You'll notice that I don't include the luminous epinoia in here, because the luminous epinoia was not given in the original calibration of our genomic identity. No, it was added later, as the story clearly shows, when Sophia realized that humanity would face the menace of the archons. She added an extra component to our makeup. That component is the divine epinoia. It's extremely important in this practice to have a clear knowledge of what these 7 or 8 elements are, and to be able to repeat them out of your own self. I would add that one more thing before returning to the plot here. I've pointed out that each of these components of our endowment is to be understood in 3 ways. First, it is a divine or archetypal capacity gifted to us from the Aeons, or the generators, who themselves receive their potentialities from the originator. Capacity. It is also a capacity, a particular capacity, an ability to behave or act in a certain way. So it is an archetypal gift, it is a capacity, and finally, it is a actual chemical component. And these chemical components are called reciprocates. So the reciprocate, for instance, I've discussed the reciprocates of the 5 components that were specified in our calibration. So there are, you might wonder, are there specific chemical, neurochemical, and physiological reciprocates to the signature components of Thelete and Sophia? Well, certainly there are. Actually, these 2 reciprocates of the signature doses, the super doses, we must begin to understand now, given to our genomic identity, are really, really fascinating and explain a great deal about our behavior, our immediate social behavior, and the problems in our behavior. Strangely, bizarrely perhaps, the signature dose of Silete, which is free will or cognitive latitude, enough rope to hang yourself, is closely related to the emotion of fear and to the chemical correlate of fear, which is adrenocortisone. So the chemical adrenocortisone is present in your body so that in a condition of fear, your body will react chemically, and that chemical will send a message to the brain that you should watch out what you're doing. Now, why is this chemical adrenocortisone, which is dangerously excessive in psychopaths? In fact, they're addicted to adrenocortisone. Why is this chemical and its corresponding emotion, fear, related to the sublime contribution of the Aeon Telete? Well, very simply because it has to be that way. Because if a sentient creature, is given enormous latitude to take chances, then it needs fear in order to tell it when it is at the borderline of the chances it should take. Now, if I'm walking along a mountain path that's rather narrow, going down into the Grand Canyon, my fear tells me when I might be losing my foothold. My fear tells me when I'm pushing the boundary a little bit too far and using a little bit too much of that cognitive latitude. I'm free to do anything I want to do as I'm walking down a narrow track in the Grand Canyon. I can do the jitterbug if I want to. I can dance around like a maniac. But if I start dancing around and doing the jitterbug, there's a great risk that I may exceed the boundaries of safety and fall off the path. How would I know that? Because adrenocortisone would kick in. My body itself would tell me that I am exceeding the limit of my cognitive latitude, and I would draw back. On the other hand, what is the chemical connected with the excessive learning abilities and proprioception granted to us by the Aeons of Fire? Well, quite simply, something called serotonin. But serotonin also has a real drawback. You see, fear has a drawback because we as creatures can become addicted to the thrill of fear. And that's not what that chemical is meant to do for us. Likewise, there's some problems with serotonin regarding the endowment to learn at a level of genius, which comes to us from the divine Sophia. Basically, there is a extremely delicate balance of serotonin uptake in the brain. And there is always, the serotonin uptake circuits are always like operating like a toggle switch that very delicately toggles out of balance one way or the other. If there is too little of the serotonin uptake, we easily become dull and obtuse. And that's one of the great, great dangers of our species. As we can see, how can we be dumbed down? Well, we can be dumbed down because we have a disposition to dumb down. And that is due to a weakening of the serotonin uptake. On the other hand, if there is just a little too much of the serotonin uptake, then we can become gullible or complacent and compliant, which is also a problem that stunts our learning abilities. So you can see that the chemical reciprocate of serotonin, that is the correlate of our wisdom endowment, operates on a very, very delicate margin. A very delicate margin. Something that we need to understand in ourselves something that we can perceive in our social behavior and in our collective behavior. And I think the symptoms of that precarious situation are pretty obvious lately. Now, finally, before turning to the plot, I ought to mention the luminous epinoia, which is the power of imagination. Recall that we were not initially dosed with the power of imagination in the calibration of our genomic identity that occurred previous to Sophia's plunge, previous to her separation. She added that, and this is an event to look at very closely, coming up in her recapitulation as well, the moment when she added that, the reasoning, as it were, in her divine intelligence that compelled her to add the luminous epinoia. So, just to complete this outline of the 8 factors in our endowment, the chemical reciprocate to epinoia is what is known as mitogenic radiation. And mitogenic radiation, which is the actual radiation of light from the ribosomes in the human body, and is closely connected with the emission of light by DNA itself, was discovered by the Russian scientist Gurvitz in the 1920s. Very interesting that the Russians were the first to discover divine epinoia in its neurochemical and neurophysical